I'd like to introduce and welcome Walter Wynn, who will introduce our program for this morning. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Walter Wynn. Welcome to the Summer ILR course, UF Research Projects by UF graduate students. I live here at Oak Hammock in the Outback and am the class facilitator. We will have 6 sessions starting today, skipping August the 14th and ending August the 16th. Here in the Oak Room, please silence cell phones, and those joining by Zoom, please remain muted until you have a question. We will entertain questions here in the Oak Room and by Zoom. Our Zoom meister is Julianne Arit, without whom we would be in real trouble. Yay, Julianne! We're up and running. In the past, our summer ILR student speakers have been recruited by previous summer speakers. A couple of years ago, Andre Cunningham came and spoke about human skeletal morphology can aid our understanding of migration histories. At that time, I asked if she would be willing to be my recruiter, and she accepted. She comes from Pembroke Pines, Florida, received her master's degree, and 2018 is now a Ph.D. candidate in anthropology. Her Ph.D. topic studies are biosocial variation across sites of the slave trade. After receiving her Ph.D. in 2022, Andre hopes to pursue a career in academia. Andre will introduce our speakers each session. Over to you, Andre.
Thank you for the introduction, Walter. Good morning, everyone. I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker this morning, Whitney Stone. Whitney comes from Easley, South Carolina. She received her master's degree from the University of Georgia for agricultural leadership, education, and communication in 2019, and is now a PhD student in the UF Department of Agricultural Education and Communication, specializing in agricultural communication. Her dissertation topic studies the experience of agricultural migrant workers in Florida, specifically studying their experiences related to travel, climate change, and COVID-19. After she receives her PhD in 2022, Whitney hopes to continue to teach and research as a university faculty member. Whitney, we appreciate you being here today, and we're looking forward to hearing more about your research. So you can go ahead and start your presentation whenever you're ready.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you all for having me today, and Andre for inviting me. It's awesome to be here, and I'm excited to kick off your series. I will have you note I have a lot of text on my slides that I don't usually have, but just in case we get disconnected for whatever reason, they're there. And another thing too is that if you do have questions and you're joining me via Zoom, and maybe you're like me and you have questions, you're like, oh, I want to ask that question now, you can drop it in the chat because it will not distract me and I can look at it later. So just feel free to type on in there if you see something or a slide and you don't want to wait till the end, because I don't know, I get distracted a lot, and I forget my thoughts. So anyway, thank you for having me. I am going to present on the U.S. newspapers' representation of agricultural migrant workers before and during COVID-19. All right, here we go. So I like to give an overview of the presentation just to kind of tell you where we're going, where we're headed. And so today we're going to start off with a reflection question, and I'm going to tell you why I did this study. I'll go over the context of the study by reviewing some literature that's already been published on these topics in different areas. I'll let you know my methods of what I did, the findings, the implications, and the conclusion. And then lastly, we'll have time for questions and answers at the end. So I hope we, hopefully have a nice conversation through this presentation. So I wanted to start off by asking this opening reflection question, and I don't know how the group is, so I invite, if you feel like saying something or just a private reflection, or if you're with others in the room, to think about your media and news consumptions. During the pandemic, did it change at all? So just kind of think about maybe, 2019, before 2020 seems like a long time ago, right? So, but just think about your media and news. Did you change the way, the amount that you consumed or how you consumed? And I'll let a couple seconds go by to see if anybody wants to say anything or just to kind of privately reflect on this. Well, as I give you guys time to think about this, when I've asked this to groups before, a lot of times people's consumption did increase during the pandemic. And I've heard talking with some friends and family, a lot of times it was a little stressful with the amount of news that was being consumed. And when asking my husband, he would straight up tell you he was addicted, and I can attest to that was happening in our household as well. And that kind of leads me to why I did this project. During the pandemic, a lot of what we were receiving in the lockdown period and the quarantine time was only accessed through the news and media. What was going on around the world? What was happening in our communities when we weren't able to go out? We were receiving this information, whether it's through the television, through internet, through the news, through social media. All this was being compounded into how we were shaping what was happening socially, our social reality. And the first time in my lifetime where we were just relying on this information and we could not go anywhere. And so this was a unique time, and it allowed me to reflect on how I was consuming news, what I was consuming. And my interest, my research lies with farm workers, and particularly my research agenda includes including people in agriculture that don't always have the time or the ability to always be included in research narratives. So whether this is farm workers, whether this is producers, that is where my research lies. And particularly with my dissertation with agricultural migrant workers, I began to think about how are their stories being represented in this narrative in the media, and what are people learning just based on the newspapers. And so that is where I kind of began my research. Fortunately, I was in a class where we learned a lot about things. I was with Andre, and where we learned about how to really use computer software to help with this. So that's kind of the why. So when we when we start research projects, we always want to get this overview of the literature. We have to scan and see what's been done, where's the gap, what needs to be done. And so I began looking at literature based on agricultural workers in the US, but I also needed to look at specifically migrant worker and farm worker communities. I also needed to look at some studies that evaluated what newspapers were saying about COVID-19, as well as the power of journalism and news media. I looked at some studies on public discourse on immigration, as well as immigration and media coverage. So that is where I was pulling all of my kind of scanning the literature and seeing what's going on, what's happening with some researchers and what they are already doing. So to begin, agricultural workers in the US, the trend is that in the mid-1980s, many farms in the US shifted to producing more labor-intensive fruit and vegetable crops. So in Florida, we know this is things like strawberries, blueberries, oranges. In other areas, it's apples, Florida's tomatoes. So a lot of these delicate fruits and vegetables need to be hand-picked and require more workers in the field versus maybe like corn or other row crops like cotton. And so this is a need that has been ongoing since the 1980s. So with this, when we look at the US makeup of workers, we know that there is a variety of non-documented and documented farm workers. But we do know from recent data that 49% tend to be undocumented, or in this case, not holding legal status. Documented farm workers are often either holding legal status, citizens working in the US agriculture, or H-2A visas. And H-2A visa holders are the lawful admission of temporary non-immigrant workers. And these are usually brought over specifically to work in agriculture. You might have heard of H-2B visas as well. And those are comprised of workers like in forestry, typically, I think sometimes construction as well. So just to give you an idea of the amount, in 2019, the US issued over 200,000 H-2A visas for seasonal agricultural work to fill anticipated shortages in labor. And so not only are we having this increase in these hand-picked vegetables and fruits, that we need these workers to fulfill the food supply, but also there is a lack of people wanting to work in agriculture in the US. So it is physically demanding, it is hard work, and oftentimes in studies, it's reported that a lot of employers cannot keep people that have applied to work in agriculture that are currently in this country because it's too hard and they can get other jobs that have benefits, because a lot of times these agriculture positions are low paying and do not offer benefits to their employees. All right, so just to kind of run by some terms and what we are talking about when we are talking about agricultural workers in the US. So we have a migratory agricultural worker is a laborer who changes residence in order to secure work in agriculture. So this could be considered an H-2A worker or somebody who changes from oftentimes when workers in Florida, they go to North Carolina or Michigan or even New Jersey. So they change their where they live to work in agriculture. There is a migrant worker, and this is a worker who travels from one district to another in order to secure work, often in agriculture. So this is oftentimes is somebody who stays in their one residence, but works in different counties, different farms, different employers to fulfill this work in agriculture. And then we also have a seasonal agricultural worker. And this is a worker who does not migrate, but is engaged in agricultural labor on a seasonal basis. So working in agriculture just when maybe there's harvest or planting, and they do other work outside of agriculture. So there is a lot of different types of workers in our agricultural industry. And it takes a lot of different forms. So a very diverse group of people. So this is what we know about agricultural migrant workers and farm worker communities. That often they seek employment outside of their home country because they want to provide more income to their families. Oftentimes, some of these countries that they're coming from outside the US have not great economies, or even things like climate change and their own farmland has changed. And so there's actually no work in agriculture anymore. Oftentimes they work to support their families. And sometimes they seek to escape political unrest. And so they leave to work for the basic needs of survival. So a lot of things going on in where a lot of these workers are coming from to work in a better and for a better life. But we do know the literature, many studies have covered some of the challenges and barriers that farm workers face, and they are vulnerable to social, economic, and political constraints. And oftentimes they continue to experience discrimination. So we know that oftentimes that if 49% are undocumented workers, that a lot of times their legal status is going to be a challenge for them because they do not feel like they can report issues, whether it is on the work site or living conditions, because they fear of being deported or being caught and sent back home. Also, without a legal status, they do not have the right to vote or to have any say on any policies that might impact them. Again, oftentimes they are in low-paying jobs without benefits, so this impacts their health and well-being overall by not being able to seek or afford health care. And then they also face cultural differences because they come from other countries and possibly speak different languages, as well as indigenous languages. So maybe they don't even speak Spanish. A lot of times there are a lot of cultural barriers as they move throughout the United States, or they work in the same community. And so a lot of times they can face discrimination because they don't fit in these communities. So we also know that on top of these barriers prior to entering and working in the US, that once they are on site, they face multiple chemical, physical, biological, and psychosocial hazards, and that degrades their health and overall well-being. And this can be seen in studies related to pesticide exposure. So there's a lot of studies that show pesticide exposure, and especially like toxic exposure with tobacco picking. And this occupational studies often look at safety, hand washing, and educational programs to help with this. Also, with the increase in temperatures, and I don't know if anybody's seen the news this morning, but that's talking about farm workers out west with these extreme heats. They face heat stress and dehydration oftentimes because they work outside, and how they get paid is by how much they pick. And so there is a motivation to stay working all the time. And even though breaks are, recognized, they are not encouraged, or the employer still rewards just based on your overall what you've picked. And so it's hard to take time to rest. Oftentimes there's reports of isolation from families. So if they've moved from different countries and they're away from their families, this can be challenging, as well as feeling isolated within the community. Again, not having those resources that people that lived in established communities feel comfortable, they don't feel connected to that. And oftentimes this overall impacts their mental health. So things like depression and anxiety, being caught by ice and things like that, that all impacts their overall well-being. So migrant workers are often invisible to many, and this can be because they do not know their involvement, or they don't live in an agricultural community. They live in a place that, is far from agriculture. They don't see these communities. Oftentimes H-2A workers, they live in camps that are established near the farms. And so if you don't drive by the farms, you don't necessarily see these workers. And then, so we also know they are invisible to a lot of social and health and academic institutions. And this often just increases their health and educational disparities among the community. So already facing a lot of challenges. Switching to some literature about the power of journalism. So journalism is very powerful and political through its use of language. So it is not neutral in any way, because language can never be just neutral as it is. It shapes public agenda. Oftentimes journalism, it reinforces our beliefs, it influences people's opinions, and it helps shape our social reality. Again, kind of looking back to how at least I was interpreting what was going on in the outside world during the lockdown. It was how I was accessing and making sense of what was going on around myself. And so with this, language use enacts identity. So the use of language can help shape people's identities. And with that, the use of language, especially in newspaper discourse, is often used to either inform, expose, or educate. And that makes sense when we think about news and what we consider news. Like, it's something to be informative, to educate, or expose something that was going on in a community. And so to me, that makes sense with with newspaper discourse. So again, I wanted to look at what was public discourse on immigration. And so studies looked at, different H-2A community members. And it was found that in the US, Latinx immigrants are often portrayed by the media with narratives about crime, sex, and drugs, and is often reflected in US immigration policy. Unfortunately, this contributes to a racialized treatment, and again, that discrimination of foreign workers. The treatment of Latinx immigrants by the Trump administration and previous treatment of Mexican and Mexican Americans during the Great Depression have often contributed to the prejudice of Latinx and immigrant communities. So an ongoing and historically, it's been an issue, and also recently. So as a result, this is a skewed public discourse surrounding these communities, and often it perpetuates this narrative that these communities are a burden to the US economy, and they often don't highlight how much they are contributing and how important they are within the US economy. So I also looked at journalism and immigration. And when I was looking at different studies about how journalism was covering immigration, I found that this Famulari, this researcher was covering news websites with varying political orientations and their coverage of Trump's zero tolerance policy on immigration and the separation of children with migrant families. The news sources focused on attributing who was responsible for separating their children from their families between the US and the Mexican border. The news stories dehumanized migrants within the stories, leaving out specific details about the people. And so not leaving any details or giving any humanizing attributes to the people they were talking about. And therefore, the researchers decided that this made the stories less empathetic to the readers and viewers. So the idea of including different words, different use of language can impact how viewers are relating to a story. Additionally, some studies have found that US journalists shifted their selection with just the use of language. So this author looked at characteristics that were some words that were given to Americans versus immigrants. And a lot of times the US journalists were giving more positive statements to the Americans and less desirable attributes and negative statements in relation to immigrant and immigrant communities. So again, kind of the power of who is writing these narratives and just word selection and what is included can impact how people interpret what is being written. So when we look at newspapers and COVID-19, we know that in the US, the media often reported topics related to COVID-19 about infection rates, transmission of the disease, how to mitigate it, the transmission, working from home, and also covering things like the economy, what was happening, job, employment rates, as well as death rates. The frequent mention of politicians over scientists in the initial months of the pandemic could have also contributed to the polarization of mitigating the virus by the spread of Americans. So this researcher looked at newspapers and how often the politicians were mentioned compared to scientists, and they concluded that this could have attributed to how it was polarized as a topic overall. So again, just word selection and angle, how that can impact how stories are being covered and what that can do for readers. So when looking at the power of news media during COVID-19, I don't know if you all reflected on this. I know I mentioned it, at least with some folks I have talked to, with this idea of being stressed and anxiety with the news. And, you know, this was actually research, which is awesome because it validates that it was actually happening. So these authors, they said that people who watched foreign news outlets and looked to social media during the beginning months of COVID-19 were more susceptible to mental health issues such as anxiety and depression. I can relate to that 100%. And then Olamat in 2020 also studied the linguistics in President Trump's COVID-19 briefings and found that he often used wartime metaphors and violent expressions and discriminative words. So what this did was, this author said, the power of Trump's language use can influence how Americans handled COVID-19 in its early stages, including how to fight the virus. So again, that fighting mentality, that wartime. So just word selections used by the former president could have impacted how people were understanding the virus. And that makes sense, you know, and how much he was being covered in the media, those daily briefings, and how that could have influenced people. So this is what we know. We've already talked about news coverage of COVID-19, all the different, what's been said about it, and what is happening right now. COVID-19 and deploying these studies, a lot of times they go through approval processes. And so these initial studies were oftentimes looking at the beginning parts of the pandemic because it takes a long time. I think things were expedited during the pandemic to get published because people needed to know what was happening. But we do know that they were looking at newspapers and media coverage of COVID-19. We also know some background of the news coverage of immigration, just generally, and more recent coverage. But we don't really know about agricultural migrant workers and COVID-19 in the media and newspapers at this time. And so this is where my study lies in these topics. So I found that there was a need to explore this more in a comprehensive way. And so I looked at both quantitative and qualitative methods. But to do this, I needed to kind of state a research question, or in my case, because I did not know what was going to be said in the newspapers, I wanted to actually find out the representation. So my overall research objective was to describe the representation of agricultural migrant workers in the US before and during COVID-19. So I began looking at newspaper selections. And so there's a ton of newspapers out there. And I was like, what do I look at? Do I look at state? Do I look at local? Do I look at near me? And so I decided, well, I want to know what's going on in the larger discourse, the national newspapers, these larger circulations. So I picked the top 4 daily circulations in the US, and that included the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the LA Times. And what I did was, the University of Florida has all these databases that are very overwhelming to search things. And we have awesome librarians that helped me figure out how to find these newspaper articles. And so what I did was come up with a couple keywords and search these databases to find any article within these 4 newspapers that mention H2A, farm workers, or migrant farm workers. And then I decided that I needed to decide how long I'm going to look at these 4 newspapers. So I wanted to look at before the pandemic to see how they were being represented. So I decided from January 1st, 2019 to October 10th, 2020. And after filtering through letters to the editor, duplicate articles, and things that pulled articles that did not have any information, but for somehow they were flagged by the database, I came up with a total of 178 newspaper articles. And the Wall Street Journal had 19, the Washington Post had 45, the New York Times had 57, and the Los Angeles Times had 57 as well. So the New York Times and LA Times had the same amount, and they were the largest. I read each article and did a line by line sentence and paragraph coding. And so I used both inductive and deductive coding while I was analyzing what I was reading. And then I also compared and contrast my codes once I had sorted them within each article. I also use MaxQDA, which is a qualitative data analysis software that helps organize these articles and creates different ways of seeing the data. And so because this was a large amount of data, this actually was super helpful in kind of having it all stored in one place and being able to organize it and search for keywords and phrases. And so it was really helpful. So this is where it gets fun with the findings. So when I did the analysis, I ended up with 4 themes emerged from the data that describe the representation of agricultural migrant workers in the US before and during the pandemic. So I found that the first theme addressed the identity of farm workers. The second theme addressed they were represented as political pawns. The third theme is they were represented by being the fillers of the food supply. And they also were represented by the fourth theme as being perils of proximity. And so the first theme involves the farm worker identity. So within the articles, they were described by their demographics, their perseverance and hardworking nature, as well as contextual histories before and during the pandemic. And so I have this word cloud. And so this gives an idea that most of the articles referred to them as from Mexico. That was the most that they were mentioned where they were from. Others that were less than 1% mentioned were Guatemala, Honduras, Jamaica, Haiti, and also just Central America in general. So gender was not represented as a piece throughout. The only thing that I found was in 2019, 2 articles referred to farm workers in relation to the Time's Up movement, but it did not mention any information. It just said farm workers and sexual harassment. And that was only seen in 2019. So I saw that the New York Times and the LA Times had the most codes related to farm worker identity. They also had the most articles that were pulled from the database as well. So it makes sense too. They were represented by their perseverance and empowerment. And so some articles covered how they were holding strikes for better rights. They also had articles describing how hardworking and skillful they were. Excuse me. So this article from the New York Times is an excerpt that says how blueberry farm workers were like musicians with their skills. And I'm just going to read this for you all. It says, the author wrote, workers at the largest blueberry farm in the Northeast moved through the fields in small groups, fingers dancing with the speed of musicians as they pick bushes heavy with fruit. The more they gather, the more they are paid during a season that lasts only about 7 weeks. So I thought this was really interesting because some authors could just write, they work hard or they're hardworking, but this really kind of says some artistry in what they do and skill. And I thought that was a really interesting way of presenting that to the reader. So continuing on with this theme, I found that before COVID-19, a lot of contextual histories, race and racism emerged, especially with environmental racism. And this was included in articles about pesticide exposure and Black farming communities in California not having access to clean water. But during the pandemic, I found that race was mentioned only when talking about documenting infection rates because the medical communities did not collect data by race or occupation in the initial stages. And then race was also looked at as in form of racism, so that the farming communities were being blamed for being centers of infection rates. And so this is an excerpt from an interview with a professor who says that she was frustrated by victim blaming and suggestions that the infection rate in migrant communities is somehow linked to poor hygiene. There's inherent racism going on, Professor Quant said. So when looking at this theme more in depth, I found that just like there are lots of agricultural migrant workers and categories that we reviewed at the beginning of the presentation, there are also multiple ways they are being referenced in their articles. So they were called guest workers, foreign agricultural workers, foreign farm laborers, agricultural workers, farm laborers, farm workers, including immigrants here legally, illegally, and seasonal guest workers. And so a bunch of different ways that's going to be represented in each article. And all of those have different roles and different ways they work in agriculture. So what I did find interesting is that the Wall Street Journal continued to use the term illegal immigrants in 2019 and 2020, and the Associated Press has discouraged the use of the term illegal to describe an individual. So that was in 2013. They discouraged the use of journalists using illegal immigrants. They said you can use illegal when you're talking about an action like illegal border crossing, but they really discouraged that. But the Wall Street Journal still continued to use it in 2019 and 2020. What I did find is that the New York Times offered the most individual quotes from farm workers and agricultural migrant workers. And they also featured the most articles giving their perspectives as well as their individual quotes. So I also found that there was more descriptive ways of writing about the community in the LA Times. And this is a long excerpt, so I'm just going to break it up just to show you how this writer went about covering this piece, because I think it's really awesome how much artistry they put in this. And the writer says, a bed filled most of the room that Odelia Leon shares with her 5 children. In one corner, a dresser spills over with clothes. For the cramped room in a 2-bedroom unit behind a house in East Salinas, she pays $1,050 a month. It's what she can afford as a field worker picking strawberries, her job for the last 9 years. A couple with 3 children rents the other room. In all, 11 people share a living room and kitchen. There is 1 bathroom. Every day, Leon, 40, is gripped with the fear that she could bring home the coronavirus, infect her children, and possibly spread it to the rest of her household. The couple in the other room also works to cover their half of the rent, she said. Every time I leave the house in the morning, I worry about how I can come back and hug my kids, she said on a Thursday evening after arriving home. And this was in June 14th, 2020. And so this is just an opening segment into a piece in the LA Times. And so it really just set a whole scene for the reader and a whole context. This could be said just saying like Leon 40 is worried about spreading the coronavirus in her household. But this writer went more into depth and really set the scene for the reader to know why that she is gripped with fear. And so that I think is just really interesting for a reader to perceive if you did not know what was happening in these farm worker communities. So the second theme was farm workers represented as political pawns. Before the pandemic, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and the Washington Post covered topics of immigration with politics and farm wages. And this is seen a lot of times with Trump, and it's saying Trump pledged to pursue changes to immigration laws that would actually make it easier for them to help farmers because you need these people. Again, interesting. I know we could do another study just on Trump's linguistic choices, but even saying these people a lot of times, and this, that can make a difference how people perceive communities. During the pandemic, the agricultural migrant workers were often referred to as one homogeneous group related to immigration policies, and H-2A visas during COVID-19. And again, this was linked to President Trump and what he was saying either at his briefings or to news outlets. So 31% of the Wall Street Journal articles had the reviewed policy, and then only 3% of the New York Times reviewed anything related to policies and immigration. So kind of the highest and the lowest between those two. Also during the pandemic, there was a different view that was represented in relation to policies, and that was that stories covered immigration with advocacy. And this is evident in the LA Times and the New York Times specifically. And so I won't read this whole quote, but it just quoted a farm worker, and the farm worker is saying, no ICE, no GEO, we're farm workers, not delinquents. They chanted in Spanish, led by Miss Ramirez, 42. And so again, covering more of that individual perspective and getting a direct quote related to policies and advocacy. So they were also represented as a community that were fillers of the food supply. So before the pandemic, newspaper articles focused on undocumented workers, farm workers, and their importance to the workforce. But during the pandemic, they were highlighted for their importance with the food supply, and they were often prioritized in newspapers, specifically in March. So that initial lockdown period, they were only related to how they were filling the food supply chain. And in later months, they began to shift focus to concerns for the farm worker safety. So initially, we were just seeing that we were just worried about getting food. We're not worried about the people actually getting the food. And this is seen by the quote that says from the LA Times, a halt or a drastic slowdown in processing visas will have an immediate domino effect of the domestic food supply of this country, said David Scaroni, Vice President of Harvest, the country's largest private contractor of H-2A workers. So this is also seen during the pandemic. The Wall Street Journal often covered that they were related to the food supply chain and how COVID has impacted the food supply from a national perspective. So oftentimes the Wall Street Journal just covered farmers, agricultural companies, but they never covered individual farm workers. And this is a quote saying, from the Wall Street Journal, President Trump and Secretary Perdue are doing everything to ensure farmers have the tools to carry out the vital work of feeding the American people, an agricultural department representative said. So this was in April 18th, 2020. So again, just covering that national, what's going on nationally, just based on that employer level, not the individual level. So the term essential was not used to describe migrant workers before COVID-19 and is completely absent in any article in the Wall Street Journal in 2020. So we know that the federal government deemed farm workers as one group of people as essential workers. And in April, the Washington Post, even though they didn't use the term essential, they called migrant workers the unsung frontline heroes of the pandemic. They're also society's most vulnerable people. But there were newspapers that critiqued the American perspective of not appreciating and recognizing this essential workforce. And this was evident in the New York Times, the LA Times, and the Washington Post. So they critiqued how the government and Americans were not recognizing their importance during the pandemic. And this is from the New York Times, and it says, sadly, it has taken a pandemic for Americans to realize that the food in their grocery stores on their tables is the courtesy of mostly Mexican workers, the majority of them without documents, Mr. Del Bosque told me. So the fourth theme is they were perils to proximity. They were described by their dangerous living and working conditions, and this was often covered in pesticide exposure articles, wildfire exposure, and COVID-19, which was the most covered at 72%. So before the pandemic, they looked at more environmental things, especially with wildfire and smoke inhalation, and then topics covering pesticide exposure. But during the pandemic, there was a huge influx of stories that covered the closed living quarters, the lack of PPE, the lack of information, and other health disparities faced by the farm worker community and also Latinx communities. So again, as noted earlier, that the Los Angeles Times and the New York Times were more descriptive on their perspectives. This is a piece, part of a piece that said, on a recent afternoon, Garcia handed out masks and boxes of groceries from a local food bank at an organic watermelon and cantaloupe farm just outside of town. Marta Ciernes, a worker there, said her crew would double in size once the harvest begins in a few weeks. To prepare, the farm has ordered a thermometer to check workers' temperatures and installed extra sinks so workers can wash their hands more often. And then she says, we're still worried about getting sick. It affects us all, everybody here and the whole world. So again, a more firsthand perspective. This was how to mitigate the transmission of the virus, but noted that the community was going to be very closely engaged with the virus and they were trying to minimize it in what they could. So what I wanted to show you all briefly is just some of, with the program I used, I can show you how trends changed. And so this is considered a code map. And for every code from each article in 2019 and 2020, the program that I used designates the size of a circle as being the most prominent, and then it connects with lines. And the thicker the line, the more often the connection was. And again, like a map, anything that's closer, the program read as being closely related. So it looked at how things were coded sentence by sentence and how closely they were related. So I just kind of wanted to go over these because I thought they were cool and how it turned out, and to look at the trends for each year for each newspaper. So we see, as mentioned in 2019, the Wall Street Journal often talked about labor being the most topic representing agricultural migrant workers. And this was closely related to the topic of immigration. But we also see down here and very far away and very small was advocacy for workers. So that was not talked about a lot in this newspaper. And then over here is H2A. And so we see that the advocacy for workers is not directly related to H2A workers. So those topics were not talked about together within those articles. This is 2020, and this is going to be a common thread, is that COVID-19 is going to be the most talked about with all the newspapers. We see that COVID-19 is closely related to labor and how that was talked about in the Wall Street Journal. We see that advocacy has become closer related and more talked about than it was in 2019. And then H2A workers are connected to that advocacy, and they're also connected to the topic of COVID-19 and how that was being covered. So this is the New York Times, and labor was the #1 topic talked about during that year, as well as immigration. This is very similar to the Wall Street Journal with how they were covering agricultural migrant workers. We see here that unlike the Wall Street Journal, they're covering more about undocumented farm workers, as well as they are covering H-2A workers, but it is not as much compared to undocumented workers that year. And closely related and linked a little bit is the advocacy for workers. Here we go in 2020, COVID-19 in the New York Times is talked about the most. We see that this is the beginning of more articles involving the workers' perspectives and direct quotes. So that's a large, a dominant trend. We see that labor is still talked about. It's kind of relating all these things together, but it's not as the prominent topic being talked about. And then advocacy is still mentioned, and it's often related to the direct quotes and the workers' perspectives. And we see here down at the bottom, the first time housing is emerging as a specific trend being talked about specifically. So let's look at the LA Times. We see in 2019, this is a little different. So this is farm worker health is the most popular trend. And this could be because of wildfire smoke as well as pesticide exposure is talked about a lot in that year. We also see that labor is also important in the topics and what they talk about. We see advocacy is closely related to farm worker health and is a pretty large topic that they discuss. Wages is also closely related to advocacy. So a lot of articles talking about the farm worker wage. Over here in 2020, we see COVID-19 is your dominant topic. It's closely related to advocacy for farm workers. So talking about different advocacy for them with COVID-19. And that is directly related to housing, a lot of those close living quarters that we saw in the literature. They also talked a lot about farm worker health still. That was still important, but COVID-19 still dominated. And then over here, it's getting smaller and a little bit distant. They still are talking about farm worker wage. It's just not as a popular trend. The Washington Post in 2019 talked the most about labor. And this was closely related to immigration, as we have seen a lot of the newspapers were covering. We do see that wages emerges here. It is a topic they talk about frequently, as well as advocacy out here in the top tippy corner. So it's a little distant from the wages, but they still talk about advocacy trends in the paper. So here we go in 2020, we see COVID-19 as the dominant topic. Again, it's closely related to labor. It's not as large, but it's very closely related. We see farm worker health is very much talked about in relation to COVID-19, and that is closely related to the advocacy for workers. So talking about health and advocacy, those tended to trend together. And then down here, we see H-2A workers were often mentioned in relation to those topics as well. Whoops, sorry, that went fast. Sorry about that. So what does this all mean? So when we look at all this together, we see that the agricultural workers representation before the pandemic was mainly related to immigration and labor. And that was obvious in those code maps. It was easy to see. But once the pandemic started, we see this huge shift in discourse. Mainly our worlds were being shifted as well, but we can see that more topics covering COVID-19, but also they were covering more direct quotes and perspectives from this community. And unfortunately, that was related to COVID-19. So only oftentimes in a negative way that they were having challenges with this pandemic, as a lot of people were. The term essential was not used prior to March 2020, and it was only seen in relation to COVID-19, even though this workforce has been the same throughout 2019 and 2020 and continues to be an essential part of the agricultural industry. So during the pandemic, the newspapers reported representation with policy and immigration. We see that they often reported challenges with the community. And then they also just posed the community as fillers of the food supply. Again, they were just kind of pieces that filled food to people. So what we know is that examining discourse like this during a public health crisis can document what is working for communities as well as what's not working. And this study can document how the community was not prepared and they were unprotected during COVID-19. And hopefully this can inform future safety guidelines and protections. once we have things like this documented. Conclusion, we just know that their representation is emerged more through descriptions and often through identities with their stories of experience. Again, those direct quotes, the direct perspectives. We saw how politics often frame them around policy and immigration. And then we also saw how they were seen as just contributing to that food supply and how they often lived and worked in dangerous conditions that were exacerbated by COVID-19. So future studies should looking at maybe some quantitative correlation with political bias with these newspapers, as well as studies should also look at local state newspapers and to see how their representation were there. And then maybe future studies can look at comparing this national description of the community with the local and state to see if there's any similar differences. I think that would be, I would want to know. I have more questions than answers at this point, right? So I have to say there were some limitations to this. It did not include local newspapers and did not include digital circulations. And the reason why is that digital circulations are often difficult to measure. And I wanted to know what was the most circulated. The representation was not compared to readers' perceptions. So what is being put out there does not mean that's how people are perceiving it. So that could be an additional study as well. And then photographs were excluded from the database because there was an inconsistency of reporting with images within the database. So I couldn't actually report it properly among the 4 newspapers. So what this says in the bigger picture, as far as my field of agriculture communication, research and teaching, oftentimes we look at analysis of materials, of content from organizations, media, and social media. And so this fits into that bigger piece there. And so how can we continue to look at what's being put out as communication materials? And often we research perceptions with messaging and new technologies. So again, just because this was said doesn't mean it's what people perceived is going on. And so that is where future studies can look at how people are perceiving these messages, what's grabbing their attention, do pictures matter? And so there's where we study that as well in my field. And then we also study how we teach by evaluating our courses and student learning. And I think this goes back to how we teach our students writing, and we evaluate their writing and evaluate our teaching. And again, I think this goes into if our students go into journalism, to know the power of language and to be aware of how different language can impact how readers perceive things. And so that is where we work with our students with teaching. That is all that I have for you today. This is now your time, if we have time for, sorry if I ran over questions, but I just wanted to thank you all for having me here today, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. I'm sure there'll be some questions. How do we do this for Zoom, Julianne? Are there questions in the audience?
I know. Let's see, I'll look at the chat.
We have a question.
I don't see any in chat. Whitney, do you?
I don't.
Okay, we're in the Oak Room here. We have a question.
Oh, yay.
So I think the presentation was excellent. I enjoyed it thoroughly. What I didn't get a sense of, or what I got a sense of, was that the media that you looked at were all really very much mainstream. Even the Journal, which in its news presentations is really not too far over to the right. So the question is, I think for a lot of things that came up, especially relating to the president, I just wonder if you try to look at things, let's say, on Fox News or some of the websites that tended to be more representative to his base.
You're asking me if I did look at those websites or anything? I want to make sure okay.
Well,
I see some.
If you did, and if you didn't, maybe that's a fertile area to look at.
Yes. So no, I agree. I 100% agree. When I first was thinking about this project, well, I'll answer you. No, I did not look at any other media sources. And when I was thinking about this, what was really hard to think about is where to look. Like there were so many things coming, and that's what's been really interesting is like this is just four, right? Like, and I, based on daily circulations, this says this is the most. But when you think about digital circulations, which is how I access my news, like what is it leaving out, right? So how many people are reading newspapers? We know it's dying. And the research says that, daily circulations printed are dying. Doesn't mean that the writers aren't still publishing digitally, but who is reading paper newspapers is not increasing. And so, especially when I think during the pandemic, that initial part, a lot of news sources were having free access digitally. So a lot of times that require subscriptions, they were saying, if it's related to COVID, it's free right now. We just want to get information to the public. Now, that being said, I had to figure out where to look, and I just based on just biggest circulations, because it was kind of like where to begin from here. So I do believe also we can continue to study political bias. Like if we look at the statements of the LA Times, what their mission statement is even, and what the mission statement of, the New York Times is, to see if they kind of correlate that way too. Like, are they living up to their mission? Because they say, they're pretty open about what they want to portray, I think, in their mission statements when I was looking originally. But I just said, okay, just for picking out news sources, I'm going to pick these large numbers to say, well, we do know this can be tracked, that these are large paper circulations. Doesn't mean people read those articles. We don't even know that, right? So there's a lot of missing links here. But the second part to that, it doesn't really answer your question, but the World Health Organization also said we were in a pandemic, and we also were in an infodemic, which there was so much inaccurate and conspiracy theories being thrown globally and accessed. And so that really made it a difficult time, I think, with people having so much access to news or having the time to access news. And so I do believe, as you mentioned, I think there's a need to kind of evaluate news sources and information and say, like, what are they saying and how are they saying it? Because I think changes subtly. It's made me, doing a project like this has made me reflect on just even word selection in news sources, and how words are even, positive words, negative words, all just linguistics can affect like maybe unconsciously how we are thinking about things. And so I think there's huge potential there to do some follow-up studies and even TV clips. When I was proposing this to our professor, he was like, you got to scale it in. Like you have to figure out what you actually, because there's so much, right? Like, because personally I consumed via web, but not everybody consumes that way. So I hope that answered your question. I'm sorry, I kind of went off on a tangent.
All right, we have another question here from our Oak Room.
Oh, awesome.
Your research has shown that the workers are concerned about health issues, in particular COVID. Did you discover anything about efforts to vaccinate the migrant workers?
So within, that's a great question. And within my sampling frame, it was to October 2020. And this is prior to the development or kind of approval of the vaccine. And so I have continued the study, and I'm still analyzing it because I want to extend it to through the election as well. And so I do think because this ended in October and the FDA did not approve of the vaccine, that therefore there were no articles about the vaccine. I've personally read articles about the vaccine, and then I have talked to community members about the vaccine and getting people vaccinated. And, just anecdotally talking to farm worker communities, there's been a lot of a lot of misinformation just within the community themselves, and saying like, we wish we had somebody out here that would, you know, help tell our family members and community members like it's okay. But they want a person. They don't want, you know, they need kind of that one-on-one person to help guide people, because like a lot of people, they just having the right information with vaccines. So but no, I did not see any, and I believe that's just to when I cut off the articles. But I think if I went further to, you know, through 2021, that would become a huge trend, or at least more so than, you know, 2021 than 2020.
Whitney, I really appreciate this huge area that you tackled. And
Oh, thank you.
to bring it down to where we could understand different pieces of it. I think we all know that the tip of the iceberg is the president, and the effect that has, even over and above a lot of the newspaper articles. But if you do any more work on this, and I really hope you will, I'll mention that there's a group here in town called the Friends of the Baker Detention Center. And it's very fascinating to me, the work that they have done. It started about 6 years ago. And if you ever decide to investigate anything along those lines, let us know. We'd be glad to give you some context.
Oh, that's awesome. Thank you so much. Yeah, I will look into that. I am currently in South Carolina, and will be headed back to the Gainesville area, which is why I couldn't be there today, because man, I wanted to be there with you all, because I thought it was really awesome for your invite. But I will look into that, absolutely. And I haven't decided if this is if I can merge all this into my dissertation, because I'm still working to see, I'm trying to do a multi-study dissertation and to look at the farm workers' perspectives, possibly including this as kind of like the national, what's the discourse nationally, and kind of comparing those two discourses, like, because I have talked to some farm workers, and, you know, specifically asked them about being termed essential, and, you know, what are their thoughts on that? And they're just like, that's great, but I mean, it didn't change what I, you know, like, it's just a term. And so kind of like what is the discourse, and what do people think of that discourse that they're actually being called, right? Like, so I have so many, I'm like, I have so many questions. How am I going to fit this in? Because I think it's, there's just a lot to really study with this community.
Whitney, we do have another question here, but let's look at chat real quick. And I was going to see if you had any comments on.
There's one that says, well done. And they're curious how many immigrants really are of Mexican descent versus other Latin American countries.
Mm-hmm. So just based on the literature that I know, and so there was a survey that went out, it was a farm worker survey. It was done in 2016. And that, I think, is the last wave that people have actually studied this community demographically, like nationally. And so I think it's going to depend on where the community, like where different communities are, but nationally, they, we're saying, let me make sure I want to think, I'd have to look, I want to think majority, and I don't have the percentage, but the majority were Mexican descent, or like kind of a generation from Mexican immigrants. So if they were born here, still working in agriculture, but there are other, you know, communities, especially like Haiti. That's a lot of farm workers in Florida are Haitian. And so I'd have to relook at that study to answer that question correctly. But I do think the majority with that last survey were, you know, I want to think like 70 something percent. But don't hold me to, I probably shouldn't even say a number because I should have the document in front of me, but a lot. were from Mexico.
All right, and we have a final question here from our Oak Room.
Right, just one observation really. At the start of your presentation, you mentioned that I think it was 46 or 48% of all these migrants are undocumented.
Yeah.
Which was a real shock to me, given all the attention that this group has received from the immigration authorities. And I'm just wondering if, as you go forward, and maybe as a foundation for your research, more description of the identity of this group, because it's clear to me, just from my perspective, I really don't understand too much about the deep identity of this group, and it's a group we're all talking about, and I wonder if we really understand it very well.
You are totally speaking my my passion, because as a novice researcher myself, we got to look at what's been done, the previous literature, and so we do that. And so when I initially started this project over a year ago, my dissertation project, what I noticed is there is a lot of public health studies based on surveys, a lot of quantitative studies based on like blood pressure, obesity rates, right? Like these kind of physical traits of a community. And it's not the whole community, but physical traits of a community. But there's really nothing looking at identity. Who are these people? We know farm workers, like we said, are a diverse group coming from different backgrounds. And so my part of my dissertation is using portraiture, which creates portraits of each worker that I'm interviewing. And so it's to really understand the individual, because so much of the time we are grouping them or they're seen as a homogeneous group. And so how are we supposed to tailor any messaging or know anything if we don't know more about the individual? And so that is my hope for my dissertation, with creating kind of portraits of each worker. So hopefully to be continued. I will help with providing you information on that. But I agree with you 100%. There's not a lot saying what's going on with these communities and the individuals who make them up.
Well, thank you very much for your presentation today. I'm an engineer, and I found fascinating your diagrams. Does your computer generate those diagrams, and can you manipulate them to show how you want the effect, or do the lines always indicate the proximity and the numerology of how many people said what?
So I think at least with that programming, so it visually, and maybe Andre, you can help me with this, because I'm like, we learned that program together in our class. But what those maps did was it said, so anything that I highlighted in the text that I said, this has to do with labor, right? It compiled all those and weighted them into those diagrams, those big circles where this is the most talked about. And so the only way to manipulate it would be to code different things more, or it would, from that point of view, I can't manipulate that diagram. It's only through the data that it pulls from. So it has to be seen in the data to manipulate it. At least that's my understanding. But yeah, it
seems to me that without that kind of a diagram, you'd be in real trouble trying to figure out what it all means.
Amen. Yes, because it was so much. I don't know what I would have done. It was a lifesaver. And it was my first time working with this software. And I think I've seen, because there's so much, as qualitative researchers, we are using ourselves as instruments, right? It's how I interpret things. And so it helps seeing data differently, and that program can spit it out differently. So to make sure you're seeing it in all the ways it can be seen. And so that is really an advantage to using a software like that.
And it removes the speaker's bias in terms of how you might have thought it should have come out, as opposed to how it did come out. Well, thank you very much. Next week, we will have another, and next week will be in person. since Whitney's in South Carolina, that would have been a little bit of a trip for her. Next week, we have a Ph.D. candidate, Molly Selba, candidate in biological anthropology, and she will discuss her experiences with education and outreach in the K-12 classroom and the importance of teaching students about the human origin study. So hope to see you all next week. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you for joining us in Zoom.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Stay well.
Thanks, Walter.
Thank you so much.